There we go. Right. So thank you for this invitation, Colin. And I've been online for an hour or so, and a very interesting discussion. There are some points we can try and address. But what I'm going to do at the moment is just tell you where we've got to with our lived experience engagement in peer review at the Lancet Psychiatry. So this is very much a description of our program so far. I'm going to go through some basics because I wasn't quite sure what was coming first, but I'll go quite quickly. So at the Lancet Psychiatry, we believe that if psychiatry is to remain relevant and achieve the ambitions for psychiatrists to stand up for the rights, dignity, and inclusion of people with mental disorders, then psychiatrists must recognize that service user experiential and first-hand knowledge is legitimate. That was published in our first commission, I think in 2015. And the illustrations I've got throughout are from our covers. All our cover artists are people with lived experience. And the one for this year is Soku Maela from South Africa. The other saying, very much from the community, is nothing about us without us. This is Laura Fisher on the cover, who is our editorial board member. Laura has lived experience, and she has set up Traumascapes to work with survivors of trauma. So people with lived experience, they come under various terms are used. We haven't discussed that. Service users, experts by experience, people with lived experience, patients, and they can be academics, clinicians, or people outside the research and the medical communities. So we believe that people with lived experience of mental health services are stakeholders with equally valuable insights into mental health research as academics, and they also have their own unique insights. So engaging people with lived experience in mental health research and practice is increasingly deemed desirable by funders, researchers, and journals. And obviously I'm speaking from the journal side, but we are working with the Wellcome Trust on a commission on lived experience in mental health research. They're just setting it up. It will then take about 2 years to report, but I will input everything we take from these discussions to that. So that's being led by Kate Martin at the Wellcome and Laura Fisher, our board member. And I'm seeing Laura this afternoon, so all this will be fresh in my mind and I can pass it on. So in terms of research in general, we see there are different stages of engaging people with lived experience in research. So the most basic is after completion of the study. So this can be before, during, or after writing of the paper, but the person with lived experience is just invited to read and comment either within the paper or separately, but they have no input to the actual study. And so Lancet Psychiatry, we have published this. So within the paper, we have published a lived experience commentary by some of the authors. Then there are working backwards in the process. So there's consulting during a study where people would become co-authors or consultants and acknowledged if they're not co-authors. Then there's before a study, which is co-production, which obviously is much better. And then there's at the very start, so co-design. And at Lancet Psychiatry, we're working to get everyone, all researchers, to think about engaging people with lived experience earlier in the process. So our attitude, our approach is, if you're at stage 1, move to stage 2. If you're at stage 2, move to stage 3. If you've never done anything, do stage 1. Okay, so we're trying to encourage people to take incremental steps, as was mentioned earlier. So at the Lancet Psychiatry, we have different types of articles. So our main ones are research articles. Now for those, we always invite a professional statistics reviewer. So this is somebody who is an expert in statistics. They're working in a mental health research team somewhere. and they are paid to do the statistics review. This is really deluxe. Not many journals will have this, but we have it at the Lancet and it's fantastic. So that does mean that if you're reviewing for the Lancet and you're not that person, you don't have to worry about statistics because they're covered. We invite 2 to 4 clinical reviewers per paper. No, we invite more people. We need 2 to 4 clinical reviews per paper. It's usually 3, but there are different needs we have for different papers, so we sometimes have 4. And then 1 reviewer coming from the lived experience perspective. As I said, it's not for all research articles, but definitely for clinical trials, definitely for anything about service delivery, qualitative research, less so on the epidemiology and the meta-analyses. We also publish what we call our green section, which are reviews or personal views. Those don't have original data, so they don't need statistics. We need 2 clinical reviews and possibly 1 review from someone with lived experience. And then we have comments or correspondence. These are not always peer reviewed, but we do invite either clinical or lived experience review if appropriate. So one thing that hasn't been mentioned, but so I thought I'd just say it, is Lancet operates single blind review, where the reviewers know who the authors of the paper are. The authors are not necessarily told who the reviewers are, but reviewers can sign their reviews if they want to. So if you want to sign your review, a lot of people just put their name at the bottom, so it's part of the comments, but you can also tick a box and then your name is passed on to the authors, but you don't have to do this. And reviews are not published. So as we mentioned briefly before, there are moves towards more open peer review, to publication of comments, peer review comments, responses. The biological sciences are leading the way in this. It's less common in medicine, but it is something we're aware of and we are following. So just to sort of stop and go back and say who benefits from peer review, obviously editors do. So peer review helps me as an editor and my team to obtain evidence to make judgments as to whether articles are worthy of publication and of a suitable standard. Authors should receive useful and constructive feedback. So from an editor's perspective, as mentioned in the Elsevier training, we think reviews should be useful and constructive. Colin, I fully understand that is not always the case. And this is another reason why we want to do as much peer review education as we can, not just for people with lived experience, but throughout academia, to improve the standard of reviewing. And then readers and scientists in general, because peer review leads to improved quality and readability of articles, and it maintains the integrity of the scholarly record. And then finally, in medicine, patients through improved dissemination of evidence and best practice. So again, this is covered by the course, but this is what we see at the Lancet. So peer review, first of all, should prevent the publication of bad work. So studies that have been poorly conceived, designed, or executed should not be published until they've been revised, or if they're really poorly conceived and designed, perhaps they should not be published at all. And peer review checks as far as possible from the submitted material that the research has been carried out well and there are no flaws in the design or methodology. As a peer reviewer, you only have access to what the authors have submitted. If the authors are hiding information or not, if they're not reporting it clearly, we can ask for more information. If they're deliberately hiding something, we can't do anything about that because by definition, they are hiding it from us. So peer review always applies to the material that's been submitted to the journal. And then it ensures the work is reported correctly and unambiguously, complying with reporting guidelines, with acknowledgement the existing body of work and due credit given to the findings and ideas of others. So that's what our clinical reviewers do, is check the paper matches or gives credit to the preceding literature. Then peer review ensures the results presented have been interpreted correctly and all possible interpretations considered, ensures the results are not too preliminary or speculative, but it should not prevent publication of innovative new research and theories. And then I think what I need to add to this, post this discussion today, is to add something about adequately reflecting the views of the people who's supposed to benefit from research and people with lived experience. So I will update this. So what are we looking for from peer reviewers? So we are not asking peer reviewers to say whether the paper is within the scope of the journal. So all journals will have a defined aims and scope that is on their website. And it's the editor's responsibility to make that first decision of, does this paper fit in the journal? And if it doesn't, it shouldn't go for peer review. So at Lancet journals, we do not publish animal research, and we publish very little research on healthy volunteers. So we are publishing clinical research dealing with patients. And at Lancet journals, we are not expecting reviewers to edit the language because we do that in-house. We have a full-time copy editing team, but other journals don't have that luxury. And so they might appreciate you picking up typos, grammar, making things explain more clearly. But for Lancet journals, we will do that after acceptance. So we started our lay service user peer review program 3 years ago. We worked with the McPinn Foundation, who already had a network of people with lived experience of mental illness who wanted to be engaged in the research process. And they contacted their database, people on their database. They drew up a short list, and then Niall Boyce, who was the editor at the time, and I, with McPinn, we went through the applications and we selected 8 women and 2 men. We then invited those 10 people to attend a training day on peer review in the Lancet offices. Because this was in the days before COVID, when we thought we had to do everything face to face. So that did limit our selection to people who were based within either in London or could easily come to London for a day. And that's one of the things now we're going to expand, we're going online, so we can have a much wider geographic spread. They then did an online course in peer review via Publons, which is it's now been bought by somebody else, but it would be similar to the Elsevier system. I don't think it would be any more engaging, and all the feedback we generate for the Elsevier training module, we should pass on to other publishers for their training modules, because I suspect it applies throughout. So of our initial 10, 7 completed their training and started reviewing for us from mid-August 2019. And 6 of those are still on the panel. 1 recently stepped down because he was finding it too difficult to make the time. And as I've mentioned, initially, we thought it would only be for clinical trials, but we expanded it to include every type of article because the participants said they wanted to look at those other types of study. We do pay our service users. So I think Kemi touched on this. So we pay £100 for a review of a full-length article. So that's either a research article or a review or personal view. In terms of hourly rate for the time you're putting in, it's better than minimum wage. It's probably not great, but it's better than nothing. So you are paid for those. And if people review, comment or correspondence, we pay £50 for that. So we have done some analysis of the program, not a formal analysis, but we've looked back because we report in various places. So we looked at the types of problems that the panel members were identifying with papers. So one is tone and language, where writing might be phrased in a way that equates the person with their mental illness or disorder. And there's actually not much of this. So before we started, I think Vanessa Pinfold at McPinn and several of the service users thought that they would be talking a lot about inappropriate language. Most of the papers that come to the Lancet Psychiatry are well written in that respect, we think, but you may look at papers and decide otherwise. Inadequate understanding of the complex reality of mental health conditions and mental health services. I mean, that's a huge area, but that is the insight we're looking for people who are living with mental illness and who are engaging with mental health services as users. Some things on terminology and definitions people picked up. Patient recruitment, and I think that would be very, I can see your group really getting into that type of thing of, are the patients recruited to a study? How representative are they? And something else that was picked up was treatment as usual. So clinical trials, many clinical trials have the control arm receive treatment as usual. Now, this is supposed to be defined quite clearly. It does differ by country, by setting, by different types of health service, but our service users have identified that treatment as usual is often not their experience of clinical practice, as in it's much better. So if you're in a clinical trial, even if you're not receiving the intervention, the treatment as usual you receive is often much better than what you experience as a patient outside the trial. So I will put these ideas together yesterday a little more, thinking about the types of problem that we would like you to identify, to look for if you're reviewing for Lancet Psychiatry. And one is outcome measures. So is the study measuring something that you consider to be useful or appropriate? And outcome measures, these studies, they're often using multiple scales. And we are now asking authors to justify their choice of their primary outcome scale and to include things like how long it takes to complete. But that's something that is the amount of time participants are expected to spend completing rating scales reasonable? Or is the trial really overloading people and asking them to spend far too much time doing this? Now, obviously, that's something that should be addressed when the study is planned. So this is much more relevant to reviewing grant proposals and research projects upstream. By the time it gets to the paper, it's too late to do anything about it, but it could still be highlighted as a problem. Then, with this group in mind, definitely representation and generalizability. So do the participants in the study represent you or people you know with the disorder being studied in terms of age, sex and gender, race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, comorbidity, any other thing? So if you look in table 1, so most of our all the clinical trials and many other studies, the first table in the paper is the demographic characteristics of the participants. So you should be able to look at table 1 and go, are the people in this study, do they look like me? Do they look like my friends, my colleagues? Is this real? Or are these a select group of people and the results will not generalize to me and my community? In terms of interventions and treatments, does the system, the treatment or the system of care seem reasonable and appropriate to you? Because if we're publishing clinical trials on interventions that you think, I wouldn't do this, or I can't, that's never going to be affordable, or it's not practical, I'd need to go to the clinic every day for 6 hours, I can't do that. So that type of input of, if this intervention were rolled out, do you think that would be feasible and applicable? So those are the types of things we are hoping that our reviewers with lived experience will give us on top of what we're looking for from the clinical reviewers. So I think this is touched on in the training, but so what happens in the peer review process is the invitation to review is sent from a manuscript handling system. So we use one called Editorial Manager. We do often email first, both all our clinical reviewers and our reviewers with lived experience. We actually send the first review by invitation by email, and you accept, and then we send the formal one. But you can accept or decline the invitation online. We talked about timing a little bit. So Lancet journals, we ask our clinical reviewers to review within a week. Some of the Lancet journals work even faster, but we think a week is reasonable. But it does take longer than that. Most people will take a couple of weeks to review for us. So we try to offer our lived experience panel 2 weeks. And as I said earlier, if they want to review the paper, but they don't have time before we make our decision, if we're going to reject the paper, then the process is ended and we withdraw the invitation. If we're proceeding with the paper, so we're inviting the authors to respond to reviews received from the clinical and statistics reviewers, we can say to the lived experience reviewer, and we say this to some of our clinical reviewers as well, please keep the paper, write your review, and we will include the review at the next round of revision. So in general, when I'm giving lectures on or talks on how to do peer review, for people who haven't done very much, it's sort of like, what can you recommend? Because the system will ask you to make a recommendation. There are generally a few options on the system listed here. Accept is very rare, because very, very rare that papers come in and they don't need revision. Okay, so but if you think it looks good and you can't see anything, and then you can recommend accept, but accept is usually recommendation after first revision or second revision. You can say accept after revision, and that means you sort of say, could they change a few small things, but I wouldn't need to see it again, that's fine. If you're making more suggestions, that's minor. If you're making a lot of suggestions, that's major. There is one called revise and re-review, and that's when you would really like to see it again, to see if once the authors have addressed your points, whether they can address them satisfactorily, and whether you think the paper is then worthy of publication. Okay, so from an editor's perspective, except after revision and minor, we would not expect to send it back to that reviewer. We as editors should be able to judge the author's response and say whether or not they've responded adequately. Major, sometimes and revise and review. If somebody recommends that, then we would usually send it back to them, or we would explain why we didn't.
Joan, sorry to interrupt, but just recognizing that we have just 15 minutes left for this webinar. If you could wrap up so that Colin can close the.
Oh, okay. Oh, crumbs. Oh no, I've gone. Okay. I think I'm nearly there. Okay. That's the different questions you might get offered on a system. You can write comments to the editor. You don't have to. And then you can write comments to the author. And again, we always say to reviewers, think how you'd like to receive comments. So be objective, accurate, and constructive. There is subjectivity in there. It's your opinion, but make sure it's couched in constructive language. And then we had a couple of quotes. I'll send the slides to Colin. So these are quotes from the people we've had giving lived experience, and they've felt they've benefited from the process. So there's some nice quotes there. And then I just wanted to say that the Lancet, not Lancet Psychiatry, the Lancet does have a special issue on race in preparation. I don't know anything about it. But it's due to be published on the 10th of December for World Human Rights Day. So hopefully you'll all look at that and like what you see. Thank you.